Hello, and welcome back to the Next Frontiers of AI podcast, where we continue to explore where enterprise AI is heading, what is important to focus on, and how to prepare now rather than later. I'm your host, Scott Hebner, Principal Analyst for AI at the Cube Research. Thanks so much for joining us. Today, we'll focus on what is needed to build AI agents that can make decisions that you can trust, verify, and audit. For the past couple of years, generative AI has delivered real productivity for most enterprises. But now organizations want more. They want agentic systems that can diagnose problems, recommend remediation actions, and help their teams make better decisions. And where that really breaks down and there's no more tolerance is just saying, hopefully the models are right, is just not good enough anymore. And because the AI model told me so, it's simply no longer good enough as an audit trail. Why? Because in the enterprise, the stakes are different. The consequences are real. Decisions must be explained and justified. Those decisions trigger actions and investments. Risk teams and executives demand evidence, and regulators then ask hard questions. And businesses demand audit and compliance trails that hold up to scrutiny. Simply put, enterprises need AI systems that can justify, verify, and defend their decisions. But here's the core issue, the immutable truth. While LLMs can deliver fluent, coherent responses, that does not necessarily translate into logical, accurate, or explainable answers. Yet many enterprise architectures today are still built on the assumption that if you add chain of thought prompting and RAG to LLMs to build AI agents, you'll get more reliable reasoning, sound conclusions, and defensible explanations. Well, a wave of new studies from Carnegie Mellon, Johns Hopkins, Oxford, MIT, Northwestern have made it clear that those assumptions are simply not true. These studies show that even when LLMs appear to reason and explain, outputs can remain unreliable and, more importantly, unfaithful, meaning the explanation can sound coherent while failing to reflect what actually drove the result. For example, rendering layers make explanations sound logical after the model has already landed on conclusion. Repeated claims, even nonsense, can outweigh a single factual counter-argument simply because the signal is louder and more repetitive. And counterintuitively, bigger models aren't better, as they tend to increase stubbornness, more resistance to new evidence, and more inertia to stick to the committed answer that they had. In fact, one study by Carnegie Mellon found that the LLMs failed to correctly identify the actual cause 74% of the time and basically fabricated the explanations. That should be taken as a direct warning shot for every enterprise AI leader. So the bottom line is this: the risk isn't just that the models can be wrong, it's that they can be wrong and produce explanations and audit trails that look defensible but don't stand up to scrutiny. And that's why LLM-only architectures are becoming a reliability trap in high-stake domains. In this episode, we're going to discuss why LLM is not an AI architecture. It's a component of an AI architecture, and why LLMs need a lot of help to become enterprise reliable. The good news, hope is on the way, by way of semantic layers for governed meaning and context, and causal layers for ensuring defensible and explainable decision-making, both making LLM answers more reliable and trustworthy. Joining me today to unpack all of this is George Gilbert, one of the most rigorous voices on why semantic layers are quickly becoming a near-term priority for enterprises across the globe. George, welcome back to the show. Great to have you here again. We always have great and fantastic discussions. Let me bring you up here.
So I've been working primarily since July on a detailed sort of migration plan for how to get to service as software, but it's not just the technology layer, but also changing your operational model and your business model. And it's about, we for 20 plus years, we've been in a SaaS world, but as we move to service as software, we're basically embodying the work of the enterprise into software, the expertise of the people. So it's not just a new software delivery model, it's a new way of running an enterprise. And the foundation of it is a semantic layer implemented as a knowledge graph so that you can orchestrate the work and the collaboration of agents and people.
Yeah, I've been, as you know, I do a ton of reading out on LinkedIn. I follow a lot of people, a lot of analysts, researchers, and I must say you've done some of the most comprehensive research on semantic layers for, especially in the context of agentic AI, that I have seen out there. So let's take this a step deeper in sort of executive terms. What exactly is a semantic layer, and why is it becoming so fundamental for agentic AI rather than just sort of a nice to have?
Okay, so agents are built on large language models. We all know that. But when we use an agent in isolation, let's say like Harvey or a call center agent, you're basically working in the same silos that we've built applications around for 60 years. It's not just SaaS. They've been built in silos because you can't have one application that spans the enterprise. But that means each agent in their current implementation speaks its own language. It lives in its own harness and its own environment, and it understands, how to prepare contracts or how to deflect a customer service call by looking through a knowledge base. But you can't get them working together as you get, people working together in an organization to produce, a product or a service with some objectives like, how we're going to, at the highest level, how we're going to grow or how we're going to make money. And the only way you can do that is if you get them all to speak the same language and have common goals. And that the first implementation of that is a semantic layer, as its name implies. It's common meaning, but that means you have to start harmonizing the data and application estate.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think as enterprises start to move beyond just having assistants or co-pilots to help people with productivity type things, and even when they start thinking a little bit beyond, repetitive task automation, when they start getting into the world of decision making and problem solving and more consequential kind of support from an AI agent, that's where things get a little more tricky. Let me just, before we set the stage here just a little bit, before we get a little bit deeper into that, show you some of the results from our recent agentic AI futures index. And this was one of the questions, which was, what is the primary activities that you envision your organization's AI agents performing over the next 18 months? So this is 625 respondents, and they were all AI qualified, so they're involved with their organization's AI. And what you can see here is clearly automation, 67%. But look how high, diagnosing problems and trying to solve them and getting help from AI agents to do that, or assist in making better decisions. You're in that 60% range. So it's clear that they want more than just the automation and the assistance. And it sort of begs the question, right? Which is, when you look at an LLM only agent, may use chain of thought and may use RAG, but without a semantic layer, where do you see the reliability issues? Where do you see it breaking down and why?
That was a great chart because at that 67% one was routine, automation. That's what you get out of existing applications. They automate the happy path because you can specify a bunch of rules and they follow the rules. Where agents get more interesting is when they can capture expertise and help you make decisions by augmenting your expertise. And those were the next two, also in the 60s, just a little below 67%. But again, if that expertise, we express in language, and that's again why you want a harmonized semantic layer. Like a good example of that might be when, let's say you're an investment bank and you have an agent that is helping you build investor interest in a bond issue, and you've trained the agent over time because it's worked alongside like a salesperson. It's trained to reach out, let's say, to the trading desks or buyers of bonds, and then it knows what signals to look for. Let's say
Right.
it listens to it gets questions from the potential customers, and based on the questions, it says, is this person interested in buying in size? Are they just sort of going through the motions because they want to maintain a good relationship with the bank? That's decision making expertise, and that's something very different from automating routine tasks.
Yeah, I mean, I think what that survey showed, the chart I just showed you, George, is that the desire is there to get these agents to do these kind of things. I'm going to show you a little bit later on when we get deeper into our conversation, a chart that shows the technologies that they plan to adopt. And I think it's going to highlight that aspiration is there, but they need to make sure that they're actually really building out that semantic layer. Because I think, like you said, and you're the expert on this, but clearly you need the semantic layer if you're going to do that kind of stuff well. In fact, I want to show you something else here too and get your comment on it. There was a wave of studies I mentioned in the intro that came out from Carnegie Mellon and John Hopkins and Oxford and MIT and I think Northwestern, PhD type level stuff. And by the way, Carnegie Mellon and Oxford are, I think, the top handful of AI universities in the world, along with MIT. So these are the top universities, right? And let me show you just some conclusions from these studies that I found really interesting. By the way, 4 of these 5 came out in January, so this month.
Yeah.
And one was, I think, late November. But like John Hopkins at the top, they concluded these models, and they're talking about LLMs plus chain of thought. In effect, lie about why they reached a certain conclusion. And Oxford found chain of thought outputs often fail to meet a faithfulness criteria and actually diverge from the model's real decision processes. And Oxford, with counterfactual explanations, they appear reasonable, plausible, but they're systematically unreliable. And Northwestern about this probabilistic patterns take over and kind of they lose the guardrails. And then the Carnegie Mellon one is actually really interesting because it goes on to show what actually is happening, and it creates the illusion of transparency and explainability. They're actually creating the explanations after the decision's already been made. And often things like, if you just repeat the same thing over and over again, nonsense, over and over and over again, it will prioritize that over a logical fact. So in other words, signal redundancy and repetition can skew an answer, right? So not only could you get wrong answers, but you can also, you get explanations that don't match the reality of how it came up to it. And to kind of net it all out, if you were to take all 5 of these studies, is that with LLMs alone, even if coupled with chain of thought and RAG, they're creating an illusion of transparency and explainability, right? And the conclusion is that the industry must shift from just trusting these things to verifying their decision logic that's anchored in semantic knowledge, which is the semantic layer you're talking about, and also to understand the causal mechanisms. Otherwise, you're setting yourself a reliability trap that may come back and haunt you in high consequence decision domains like the enterprise. It was very interesting to read all that stuff.
That was an awesome set of studies and citations, because basically you're distilling it down to the fact that the LLM is a probabilistic engine, and not only probabilistic, but it actually it computes in 2 spaces. One is in token space, which we can read, but also in the latent space, which we cannot read. And that's the people working on that, like mechanistic interpretability. It's sort of like the difference between our conscious brain, where we can say, oh, I can tell you what I'm thinking. That's token space. But the firings in the brain, in the unconscious part of the brain, that's latent space. They can have completely different reasons. And as you're pointing out, this is really, really valuable stuff. As you're pointing out, you cannot necessarily rely on the explanations and the causality that comes up with the model, and that's why you need something. That's why we're going to coexist for years with a deterministic complement. Now, the foundation is the implementation of the semantic layer typically is a knowledge graph. But as you're pointing out, there's an experimentation layer above that where you can try out different things where it's not lying between, what's happening in token space and latent space. You try out something symbolically and in an experimental layer. And then when you want to when you have your answer and you want to make it repeatable, explainable, performant, precise, then you put it into the knowledge graph.
Right. And you read through, I think that's 100% right. It's like a 3-layer type of, high level it's a 3-layer architecture, right? And these studies actually allude to that because they talk about semantics and knowledge graphs, and they talk about causality. They talk about the LLMs. They get really deep. You got to be a PhD to read them. But, some of my new friends like Grok and ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude help interpret it. But basically, I think it's consistent with what you and I have been talking about for some time, which is enterprises have to build upon the foundational LLM architecture. They've got to create a 3-layer architecture that has LLM and chain of thought at the bottom, right? That's the fluency and coherence layer. And then you got semantic for meaning and context. And as you said, a common language. And then you got sort of a causal layer that is for defensible diagnoses and decision type, interventions and things of that nature. And the graphic that I kind of created that kind of articulates this at a very high level is, again, 3 layers, right? Chain of thought and an LM-based foundation, which most enterprises have today. You're driving the next major step here, which is probably where people should focus, which is get that semantic layer built out, right? Which you could infuse, as you know, and educated me about, some cause and effect mechanisms into it. And then there's a causal model layer, which is where you start to get that diagnostics, you get the interventions, you get, the experimentation. If I did this, what would happen versus if I did that? And that's really sort of the roadmap into the future that these agents have to sit upon. Would you agree?
Yeah, and that is a very, very advanced layer, and that's the layer where when we talk about having armies of agents, working across an enterprise. The example I use, just a simple analogy, is we had self-driving cars agents in the desert 30 years ago, and they could drive like 100 miles, but solo. Once they needed to work with other self-driving cars, like to handle, other self-driving cars on the road. In other words, other agents, other humans driving cars, also non-deterministic agents, pedestrians. We've been struggling for 30 years to get that right. And if we had a dynamic 4-dimensional map that they all shared that could predict the trajectory of the pedestrians, the human drivers, the self-driving cars, we would have armies of self-driving cars on the road now. And what you're describing is that dynamic 4-dimensional map, the semantic layer, the causal experimentation layer, but then it gives them a real-time state of the world. And that's what we're missing, to have armies of agents directed towards common goals. And in the meantime, we'll still have islands. We'll still reinforce the silos, and there's value in that. Having agents deflect your call center, escalations, or having people do, accounts payable, agents doing accounts payable, accounts receivable, but you won't get transformational re-engineering of how the organization works.
Yeah, without it. And I think, thinking about like a hamburger or a sandwich, you got the bottom bun is sort of the LLM chain of thought. The meat is, the backbone, if you will, is the semantic layer. And then the top bun is the causal layer the causal layer and the LLMs both feed into the semantic layer. The semantic layer is where it all gets captured, right? Like you said, it's where it governs actions, and it's where the policies sit, and ontologies, and the common language, right? And the buns are the ones that make that more and more powerful, more and more dynamic. And I think it's a great architecture. But so given that the semantic layer is such a critical backbone of this architecture that we're trying to advance here, let's talk a bit about the core building blocks of what enterprises actually need to build a semantic layer, like knowledge graphs and policies and action spaces, and what are some of the quick wins that you see to get started here in building this out for your agentic strategy?
So think of it as, for many decades, there have been efforts to do these intergalactic models of the enterprise, a data model of the enterprise. So how everything fits together, or even an intergalactic end-to-end application like ERP at one point was supposed to capture all your business processes. Those never work. So it has to be, it has to start bottom up, but it has to have some top-down governance so that there's harmonization as you keep going. Just to put it in concrete terms, if it's pure bottom up, there's an example I love to use from a James Michener book, The Source, where there's this ancient town in what today Israel, where they want to build a tunnel to the water source that's outside the walls of the town. And in a bottom-up way, they start digging from the tunnel, from the water source outside and from the town. And as they keep digging, the two sides of the tunnel don't meet. That's if you do everything bottom up, they won't meet. So the way you do it is you have some governance function that, and it can't be too heavy, but some governance function that says, let's take a couple bottom-up exercises where you harmonize data that's looking across different silos in your analytic data estate and can take action across some of the silos in your operational application estate. So like one example, going back to a simple one, like in customer service, you might be able to look at the state of the customer that you're talking to and understand how important they are. You might look at what their recent purchases are, what their lifetime value is. You might look back into the ERP system to see where is their current order, something like that. That's looking at the data space. The action space might be based on what's the state and the value of the customer. Are you going to give them a priority, return? Are you going to give them some gift card? But that then updates an operational application. And the way you might implement that is you harmonize all that, the data state in a knowledge graph just for that workload, but you also harmonize the action space so that the agent is looking at one single set of concepts about what's the state of the customer and what tools can I invoke to change the state of that customer or customer related processes. And you do those one at a time, and you do them so that you're measuring an outcome that you want to change. You want to increase customer satisfaction, or you want to decrease the amount of time that it takes to process, customer orders, or for a bank to onboard a new customer. You take one outcome with some metrics and you organize everything, all the data that you need and all the actions that you need to take to affect that outcome. And you do it piece by piece. You don't try and harmonize all your data and applications because you'll never be done.
Right. Let me show you another question from the Agentic AI Futures Index, which I think you would like, which are the following quote unquote reasoning technologies does your organization plan to invest in over the next 18 months? So chain of thought, because it's in the LLMs, okay, good. But look at knowledge graphs, right? Pretty high. So half of organizations are saying that knowledge graphs are in their roadmap. Now, keep in mind, George, when we looked at those that wanted to do make better decisions and diagnose things and problem solve and all the things that you need a semantic layer and therefore a knowledge graph for, that was what, 62? So there's a little bit of a gap there, which may imply that there's a desire there to do those kind of activities, but they haven't connected the dots yet to the need to build a semantic layer out with knowledge graphs. So I think this is a good, the marketplace is reacting and seeing what you're advocating here, right? Is the knowledge graphs are really key next step.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that chain of thought was at the top, because I think that people are conflating chain of thought with agentic reasoning. I mean, because an agent does, like it takes in some context. It makes a plan. It invokes some tools to, in pursuit of that plan, it gets the results back. That's all like a chain of thought or reasoning traces. But that alone does not sort of give you a successful agent.
Right. And I think it's more correlation based, probabilistic stuff that's built into an LLM, and that's what I think people are seeing, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
When they sort of identify that, but clearly, if you look at an investment stream, at least according to this survey, it's clear that knowledge graphs are the next big investment area, which is good, which means people are obviously starting to build the semantic layers. The other thing that was interesting in that chart too was the causal layer that we've been talking about is not too far behind that. So I think there's an understanding of the need to sort of understand counterfactuals and conditions are changing, and what if I did this versus that, and what if I do A, B, and C instead of D, F, and E? What are the ability to do that experimentation and that and do it in a more dynamic setting, right? And that's where the causal layer comes in, that really understands cause and effect relationships among entities that may change when conditions around them change, right? The output and the direction you might head can change. And I think step one for enterprises should be to really focus on that semantic layer, but keep in mind that the likely next step after that is going to be to start thinking about that causal layer. Agree?
Yeah, because I think once you start implementing, always in a technology transition, the new technology is an addition to the existing technology. They complement each other, and so the semantic layer allows the agents, the new technology, to see across the islands in your data and application estate. But this next step that you're talking about is when you want to say, okay, I want to perform like controlled experiments as to when an agent does one thing or another, what are the outcomes? And then it's almost like having forking your GitHub repository to do a new branch, and then once you decide which outcome is the one that is causally accurate, then you would put that back into the semantic layer as so that there's one harmonized source of truth that's the deterministic source of truth.
Yeah, I think going back to your example with the service rep, you had one of the options that they can do to remedy a issue was to give a gift card out, right? And so you could, in that layer, say, well, if we were to cut the amount of gift cards down by 25%, what would be the end effect on our outcomes, and how much money would that save, and how much customer churn may that happen? Or if we were to, swap out gift cards with, discounts, or it allows me to sort of do that what if scenario type stuff, decision, like you use the word experimentation. I think that's right. It's intervention type stuff. And then if there's agreement that this might be a better way of doing it, then it gets encoded back into the knowledge graph, right? So it creates a little bit of dynamic change as things around you change, because maybe gift cards become less attractive for whatever reason, right?
Yeah. Or you try an experiment with what are the different interventions that keep the customer loyal after they've had a bad, either product experience or service experience.
Yeah, because you might actually find out, if you were to doing, the cause and effect relationships, like giving out a shitload of gift cards doesn't actually change that much the outcome. And so you're throwing more money away than you need to, and doing those kind of what ifs and counterfactuals, and, understanding what influences what. And I think that's what that layer helps to bring, or it helps to mature what you would have in a semantic layer. So I kind of think about in this way, which I think is close to what we're saying here, right? Where the LLMs are your natural language synthesis, right? They're the communication layer, and they can have coherence and fluency and helping with the narrative. The semantic layer is your contextual grounding, right? As you said, source of truth. It's the common language, and it understands things, like it says here, the difference between blood pressure and hypertension. And you could jump around and solve things across entities because they have relationships and action spaces on what to do next and all that. And then the causal layer is, like you said, experimentation. So it's intervention testing, counterfactuals, what if we do this versus that? And try to really do some work to isolate the two drivers of change, right? Not just statistical noise, like the gift card. Am I giving too many gift cards out because those things are expensive? And it kind of like, brings you back into that three-tiered architecture that you build out over time.
Okay, so the way to think about that excellent chart is that the semantic layer itself matures over time. The first incarnation is as a data plane, where it's just harmonizing the concepts like customer, support case, order, that sort of thing. And then it's useful for queries across the analytic data islands. But over time, it grows to include the action space. The action space are the processes that link those entities. Concepts are entities, like the people and resources in your business. The processes are how you add value, how you use those people and resources to add value, to create your products and services. So that knowledge graph grows over time. And then, as you pointed out, you would have an experimentation layer where you're like, where you want to determine, what causes what. And you have formal, interventions with controlled experiments. And then, when you decide what actually causes something, that becomes part of the action space.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a great way of looking at it. And you're right. There's another diagram that get your 2 cents on, which is looking at the right-hand side of it, is more about what are some of the things you can do now if you have that 3-layer architecture, or at least have a semantic layer, right? So you can do, root cause remediation, right, and detection. You can do the counterfactual planning, intervention testing, as we've been talking about, the compliance and the policy defendable decisions. You got evidence grounded RAG, because you have causal verification. Your decision trails, right? Your audit trails, your compliance become more, more robust, if you will, or more accurate. So there's a bunch of things you get by building off that LLM layer, by building the semantic layer, and then starting to think about the decision, experimental layer, which is causal. And if you tie back to what we were looking at in the agentic AI futures index survey, that's a lot of the themes of what people need and want, right? Because if there's one word that defines the state of AI in the enterprise, it's the word trust. People need higher degrees of trust in what they're getting. And so these are two really key layers to build out as time goes through.
Yeah, and that was a great chart, because it's that we can't do it all in the agent layer. Just to go back to what Satya Nadella said at the BG2 podcast last February, where he's like, all the logic of today's software is going to move up into the agent layer. He was really saying that just so he could tweak Mark Benioff at Salesforce, because Benioff had called Microsoft 365 Copilot Clippy, which was a disparaging reference to a failed Microsoft assistant that was from decades ago. But what he left out was you need that deterministic governed layer. And so ever since, people are like, oh, SaaS is going out of business. But your chart articulates better than pretty much anything I've seen why you need both, why you cannot just live in the agent layer with current technology, because the agents do not have that deterministic, auditable, like a chain of thought is not an audit trail.
No.
So yeah, I think that the chart's excellent.
Yeah, those universities certainly made that abundantly clear. So okay, well, we're running out of time here, but one last question for you, which is, what's the practical advice for the audience that's watching that wants to get involved and start to think about building out a semantic layer? What should they do to get started?
So yeah, it's a great question, and then the terminology is overloaded in the sense that you can't really take, for instance, what the business intelligence tool vendors call a semantic layer. That helps you harmonize your analytic data with metrics and dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want agents to perform work, that's good for queries. But if you want them to perform work that changes the state of the enterprise, that in a business process, you need something more than metrics and dimensions. And that's where you pick, one particular outcome that you want to change, like we were talking about earlier. And you identify the data that's needed to harmonize that so that the agent can say, what's the state of this process? And then you identify the APIs or the connectors, and you harmonize those into the action space. And then you have a subgraph of a knowledge graph, and that's how you build it out piece by piece. And you have a central governance function so that you make sure that as you build out these individual pieces, they harmonize themselves together.
Yeah. Well, I encourage everyone, reach out to George, and he can help you get started on LinkedIn or through the Cube Research website. And he's also, George, right? You're working with a ton of vendors that provide solutions in this space that make it easier to do this kind of stuff. You don't need PhDs anymore, right? So I encourage them to do that. And George, thanks so much for joining us today. This has been a great conversation, as always. And we'll keep pushing the semantic layer.
All right. Thanks, Scott.
All right. Well, I think in the end, the takeaway is quite clear that enterprise agentic AI needs more than just LLMs plus Game of Thrones. That's kind of funny. A chain of thought and RAG architectures. They need systems that can justify, they can verify, they can defend their decisions, especially in these high-stake environments where the fluency of these LLMs is not a proxy for correctness. So the path forward is increasingly clear. New semantic layers need to be built out over time, infused with causal layers. And that's what's going to make these LLMs more enterprise ready and more trustworthy. So I think it's time to start in 2026 to start taking that next step up the ladder to really building out powerful, differentiated agentic solutions. So anyhow, if you found this conversation useful, please subscribe to the Next Frontiers of AI. Share this episode with your colleagues. I'm Scott Hebner, and on behalf of George Gilbert, thanks again for listening. We will see you next time. Thanks for now. Have a great time ahead of you. Bye all.